All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the 696T presentation. We just do have a poll if you're wondering if all of a sudden you're in the room and there's a welcome poll, we ask that you would go ahead and answer that. And while everyone is logging in, please take a moment to answer the welcome poll question that is shown there on the screen. And it is, what is your role in tribal organization? And you're only able to choose one of those that is on the screen there. So again, you are in the right place. You are at the 696T Financial Report Form Completion Instruction Overview presentation. So welcome everyone. We do have a welcome poll. We ask that you would just go ahead and submit your answer, and we'll give a few more seconds within this minute here to get everyone situated and getting to their computers, and hopefully everyone is ready to roll. One other thing we just want to mention is if you do have the form in front of you, the 696T form, any information that you might have, such as the 696T instruction information as well, that might be helpful. You might be able to follow along in some of these areas. Just maybe a tip that maybe if you are at your office and you're able to have that available. So again, we just ask, thank you for participating in our welcome poll. We just ask that if you would answer here, what is your role in your tribal organization? We have CCF administrator, co-administrator, tribal fiscal staff, tribal leadership, or if other, we just ask you add that role in the chat box. And welcome from all afar, from all tribal nations. Welcome to our 696T. Thank you for submitting your answer here at this poll question. We are welcome you to our webinar, the ACF-696T Financial Report Form Completion Instruction. If you are just logging in, you are seeing a welcome poll. We just ask that you take a few seconds here and answer that. And we are seeing many of our colleagues and those in our CCF programs logging in. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. All right, we are a few minutes after the top of the hour. We do have quite a bit to answer. We'll go ahead and remove our poll and move on to our next slide here. Again, welcome to our ACF 696T financial reporting. We are so glad you're able to join us today. It is all great for you guys to join us. So again, please introduce yourself, listing your name and your tribe in the Tribal Child Care Development Fund program that you are representing in the chat box. We also do have another check-in question. We're just wanting to know the group that we're in. We want to get to know you a little bit more. So check-in question is, who do you coordinate within your tribe to complete the 696T report? We'll also have this check-in question dropped in the chat box as well, so that you all could go ahead and introduce yourself as well as answer the question. So welcome everyone again from all ends of our CCDF program families. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you're able to join us on this presentation here and hope you find it all super helpful. Thank you again for joining us here. We just ask that you introduce yourselves and do the check-in question if you could. Who do you coordinate with your tribe to complete your 696T report? We appreciate that information. Awesome. All right. Well, welcome. My name is Dolores Frawa. I am representing out of the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building as one of the subject matter expert on the topic of physical management and internal controls. I do have other colleagues here with me that will be assisting and presenting today's topic. So I'll go ahead and have them present themselves, and we'll just go in line of the pictures above at the corner. Rachel.
Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon, and potentially good morning to some of you. My name is Rachel McKinnon. I am a child care policy specialist in the Office of Child Care, and I'll turn it over to Patty.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Patty Bollinger. I'm a regional program specialist with the Office of Child Care, working out of Region 6, and I'll pass it to Michael.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Colbita. I'm a program specialist over here in our Region 10 office in Seattle, and I will pass it over to Anthony.
Good afternoon, Anthony Santomo. Sorry, having problems with the camera. I'm a grants management specialist with Office of Grants Management, and I'll turn over tomorrow.
Oh, Meryl, you're on mute still?
I had a fun time chatting to myself. Hello, I'm Meryl Burkhart. I'm a grants management specialist also with the Office of OGM. And I will turn it over to Dolores.
Thank you, Meryl. Thank you all of presenters for assisting and helping present today. So in today's session, we certainly want everyone to gain a deeper understanding of the purpose and requirements of the 696T and financial reporting. We also hope to explain and describe the components of the ACF-696T Financial Form, including those COVID relief funding reporting requirements as well, and then provide an overview of the 696T report submission process, as well as a review of the online data collection, and talk a little bit about the payment management system and the steps to gain access to this information. So, all right. We want to be sure that you all are aware where to get your help and where to begin. There's a list of resources and information that's here on the screen. We will go ahead and put all these links in the chat box for all of you to have these resources readily available. If you like, if you're able to, pull up the 696T instructions as well as the form, because this kind of aligns to what we'll be presenting today, in hopes that it will be a lot more clear and information is understandable. So thank you for, again, getting this information is helpful for you all. So in coordination between program and physical staff, coordination and communication between program and physical staff is a very huge key factor to ensure successful program operations. Physical staff get the information and they need to track the Child Care and Development Fund funding as required by regulations, so keeping a really good track. Program staff get the information they need to make informed budgetary decisions and expending of funds appropriately and submit timely reports. As well as information in coordination is having timely reports can reduce adverse audit findings and the potential for sanctions, penalties, or even negative grant awards. So again, coordination between programs and physical staff is super helpful. So just as a reminder about the CCDF funding, it is comprised of two funding sources. You have your discretionary funds that is provided under the Child Care and Development Block Grant Act, and the discretionary funds include a base amount of $30,000 plus a per child amount for each tribe. So tribal consortia receive the $30,000 base amount or a prorated amount per member plus a per child amount. The total annual amount of discretionary fund changes each year, and it is determined by Congress. This means the amounts that tribal lead agencies receive above the base amount changes each year. The other funding is mandatory funds, funding provided to eligible tribes and tribal organizations under Section 418 of the Social Security Act. Tribal mandatory funds are calculated solely on a per child basis and do not include a base amount. These funds are permanently appropriated, which means the total amount for the tribe does and fluctuate each year. So for instance, 100 million of the mandatory funds are set aside for tribal lead agencies each year. So per child amount for both discretionary and mandatory funds depends upon the total number of children in all participating tribes, which is determined by the child count submitted every 3 years. Just make note, in Alaska, only 13 entities defined by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act may receive mandatory funds allocations. So please let us know if you would like more information on which tribes or tribe nonprofit organizations are eligible to receive mandatory funds. So next here on the screen, we just want to mention about your CCF spending requirements. This slide provides an overview of the CCF required spending amounts for tribes. These requirements are specific to tribes with medium and large allocation sizes, but indicates where the requirements apply to tribes with all allocation sizes. So tribes that have consolidated their CCF program into an approved Public Law 102-477 plan are also subject to these requirements. We will go into more details of each of these spending requirements later in this presentation, but here is a brief overview. So we here have the direct services. Tribes with medium and large allocation sizes are required to spend a minimum of 70% of the remaining discretionary funds on services directly to eligible children. Direct services consist solely of expenditures for children's childcare service to eligible children. Next, we have administrative costs, which includes your indirect cost rate. Tribes may spend a minimum of 15% of their combined expended funds for administration. These base amounts are not subject to this maximum. Next are non-direct services, which are a program costs that are not direct services to families, administrative costs, or quality expenditures. And next we have the quality expenditures. Tribal lead agencies must use at least 9% of their CCDF funds, not including the base amount, to improve the quality and availability of childcare. Tribes of all allocation size must meet the 9% minimum, and tribes with medium and large allocation sizes must spend an additional 3% on infant and toddler quality activities. The discretionary base amount provides an important source of funds that can be used for any costs that are consistent with the purpose and requirements of CCDF. These funds are the most flexible since they are not subject in the administrative cost limitation, direct services, or quality expenditure spending requirements. The base amount can provide tribal lead agencies with an opportunity to develop their infrastructure and capacity to operate a childcare program and be used for administrative costs, direct childcare services to children, non-direct services, or quality activities. So I'll now turn this part over to Rachel to take us to the next slides.
Great, thanks, Dee. Now we're going to jump in a little bit into the actual system that you'll use to submit your 696T form. So tribal lead agencies must submit their ACF-696T report electronically through the online data collection system, or OLDC. OLDC reduces paperwork, allows for quicker processing, automatically completes some required calculations, and checks for potential errors. Tribal lead agencies with OLDC assignments can access the system through grant solutions, and tribal lead agencies without that assignments can access the system after submitting a report form. And they should also CC their ACF regional office contact. The form can also be found attached to the FY 2024 program instruction. And remember to submit an OLDC request form for each staff person who will play a role in using OLDC. So the links to these different requests, websites, and emails have all been dropped in the chat. So getting started, first, to access the OLDC, you'll need to open an internet browser window, preferably Internet Explorer, and type in the web address. Or you can click through the link that's in the chat, or once you do get a copy of these slides, there will be live links in the slides. For quicker access, you can add the Grant Solutions login screen to your bookmarks or favorites. Once the Grant Solutions homepage appears, you click the login button, then the portal screen appears. From the menu bar, click OLDC to open the online data collection homepage in a new window. If you don't see the menu option, you may be in the new homepage view, and you can toggle the Grant Solutions home view to the older version and then click on the OLDC menu option. And finally, the online data collection homepage will appear. If you don't have access, you'll get a notification saying you don't have access and you'll need to submit the form to OLDC. So if you don't have access, you let your regional office program specialist know as soon as you can, and then submit the OLDC request form. As we said before, this form is attached to the there's a link in the 2023 program instruction. And you're also going to want to save your case number that you'll receive from the help desk. And that way, if you have any issues, you can reference that case number. And just remember, multiple folks need to have access to OLDC. A data entry staff person and another staff who is an authorized official to certify and submit any reports. These need to be two different people doing these two different activities. If you're not sure if you have access to the OLDC site, don't wait until the last minute to complete the access request form. You should request it as soon as you know that you're going to be a part of this process and get that access started early. All right, so now I'm showing you a snapshot of the report form. It looks really busy right now and there's a lot going on, but we're going to go through this line by line to explain how to complete the form. And I did just want to remind folks again that it's really helpful if you access the form while we're walking through this so you can kind of get a sense of how to use it. I just dropped another link to the form in the chat. So if you want to open that up right now so you can follow along, it'll be super helpful for you. So in this next graphic, we show all of the currently available funding streams, columns A through P. So each of the columns represents a different funding stream in the form. And this document, this screenshot right here is a useful reference to see how each column is specific to the funding stream that tribal lead agencies will be reporting on. So in the following slides, we'll show the line items, each of those line items in the report, and how they apply to each funding stream, which is represented by the column. So for example, if a line item applies to column A, that means it applies to mandatory funds. So you can see how we're going to be listing the columns at the top of this slide. And note that not all tribal lead agencies receive funding from all of the 7 funding sources, but tribal lead agencies must report expenditures for all of the funding that they have received. So even if you're not completing the form for every column because you haven't received those funding, you'll need to report on that funding that you did receive. So let's start looking at the 696T form, and we'll start with line 1, which is federal funds awarded. So line 1 is the amount of funding that was reported for any given funding stream. And again, you can see at the top of the slide, it shows which columns or funding sources this line applies to. So the federal funds awarded line does not apply to all of the funding sources, just those listed across the top. OLDC automatically enters the amount of federal funds awarded into line 1. So you can double check this number by accessing a couple of sources. One is the amount of funds awarded as indicated by your notice of award received from ACF. The notice of awards are cumulative. So if you look at the 4th quarter award, it should be the total amount for that funding stream. One note about this is that the 4th quarter award notice of award does not include any reallotments, and the reallotment and notice of award should be referenced for that final amount. The amount of funds can also be found on the Office of Child Care's website, where we list all of the allocation sizes for each tribe. Make sure that you're using the final allocation table for the relevant grant year, since these amounts are updated throughout the year as those numbers change, particularly with the reallotments. And finally, the funds awarded can also be found in the PMS, or the payment management system. So if the amount listed in line 1 does not match your records through these 3 sources, reach out to your grants management specialist and they'll be able to help you identify the actual amount awarded. Okay, so for line 2, this includes the transfer to construction or major renovation. So if the tribal lead agency has transferred funds to use for construction, OLDC will automatically enter this information into the forms. And this only appears in the columns or funding streams with construction. So not in the originating funds, but after they get transferred to construction. So for a little bit more detail, the approved award amounts that have been transferred to construction or major renovation will be automatically entered into line 2, but not the amounts that have been expended. The amounts expended are reported in another line. So again, you'll just want to confirm the amount that automatically appears in line 2 for your construction funds are the same as those amounts listed in the notice of award or in PMS. So note that PMS combined mandatory and discretionary construction funds into the same column. All right, so on to line 3, total funds available. And this is a line that appears in all of the columns. And you have a little more detail here. So this line takes line 1, which is the federal funds awarded amount, minus line 2, which is the amount transferred to construction. So that way, line 3 gives you your total funds available, adjusted for any construction amounts. And this is the line that you're going to want to use to really match your expenditures to make sure that you're spending all of your funds. And now I will turn it over to Patty to share more about the different spending requirements.
Thank you, Rachel. So now you've got on your report, you'll see what funds were awarded, what funds are available in the different columns and the different funding streams. And we're going to talk about expenditures. And these, of course, are items that you will enter directly into the OLD system, into the report. So line 4 is about expenditures for direct services. So in that column, you'll put in all your expenditures for childcare services, or sometimes we refer to them, as the report does, as direct childcare services. It's important to note, if you look at the graphic, that you do not report any direct childcare service expenditures in columns N, O, and P. Those columns are actually refer to the ARP Act stabilization funds, both the stabilization amount, the stabilization base amount, and any ARP stabilization funds that you might have set aside for construction and or major renovation. And we know that all of those funds cannot be used for direct services. So this is kind of a helpful graphic in terms of seeing what requirements the different funding streams have. Let's go, if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about what direct services are. Direct services is care for eligible children with eligible providers. Those expenditures can be payments to providers made through contracts, grants, certificates, or vouchers, or direct services, or with the costs associated with operating a tribally operated childcare center. So as a reminder, tribal lead agencies with medium and large allocations must expend not less than 70% of that aggregate amount of discretionary funds for direct services. And of course, that's calculated after taking into consideration and meeting the quality set aside, the administrative cost maximum, et cetera. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The next slide is line 5. And that's where we're going to talk about childcare administration. So here you're going to enter in those columns any expenditures of federal funds made for childcare administration. Again, NO and P are not reported in this line because administrative expenditures for the stabilization ARPAC funds are reported later in the report, down in rows 11, A through F. So it's also important to note that 15% administrative cost cap is calculated at the end of the liquidation period. What happens is they take the sum of columns A, B, D, E, F, H, I, and L on line 5, and that total of those expenditures cannot exceed the sum of those same columns on line 12, which is your total expenditures. So that 15% limit for administrative costs is calculated on the total of those columns, meaning that 15% limit does not apply separately to each individual column. So I want to make sure you understand that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about administrative costs. I wanted to make sure that you're aware that for a number of the supplemental funds that were awarded in 2020 and 21, when Congress appropriated additional funds to deal with the response and recovery from the COVID pandemic, each of those funding streams has specific flexibilities and requirements. So on the screen, you'll see the administrative costs associated with all those different funding streams. So it's important to understand the similarities and differences among the various funding streams and the way the different funds can be used to support your administrative costs. So you'll see there is a live link on this page that you'll get when you receive a copy of the PowerPoint, but we'll also put that link to that resource that the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center pulled together for us, because it is really a helpful resource to have when you're considering your administrative expenditures and what those requirements are for each of the funding streams. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So the regulations are very clear in the final rule in providing examples of administrative activities, and we wanted to share some of those with you. So they are planning, developing, and designing the CCDF program, providing local officials and the public with information about the program, and that includes the conducting of public hearings, preparing the application and plan, developing agreements with administering agencies in order to carry out program activities, monitoring program activities for compliance and program requirements, which is different from monitoring of providers. So I want to make sure I'm clear about that. Preparing reports and other documents related to the program. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see other examples that are outlined in the rule. Maintaining those substantiated complaint files, coordinating the provision of services with other federal, state, and local child care, early childhood development programs, and before and after school care programs, coordinating the resolution of any audit or monitoring findings. And again, those are program monitoring findings, not child care provider monitoring, evaluating program results, and managing or supervising persons with responsibilities for any of those administrative activities. So those are the examples of allowable administrative costs that are defined in the final rule. And as a reminder, that 15% maximum, of course, does apply to tribal lead agencies of all allocation sizes, and that base amount that you receive is not subject to the administrative cost limit. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so if we look at line 6, that's the expenditures for non-direct services. So here you would enter all expenditures related to non-direct services for the various funding streams. So a lot of times there can be some confusion about non-direct services. They are not considered administrative costs and do not count towards your 15% administrative cost limit. And again, stabilization, the ARPAC stabilization fund expenditures for admin are not reported in this row because they are expenditures that are again reported in row 10 and 11. Let's go ahead and talk about what non-direct services are. So we just discussed how the final rule provides examples of administrative costs. It also included a list of activities that should not be counted towards the admin cost limit. This was included back by Congress when the administrative cost cap was set. In 1998, they had a conference agreement that accompanied the law that indicated these activities would not have to be considered administrative costs under CCDF. So these include the establishment and maintenance of computerized child care information systems, establishing and operating a certificate program, eligibility determination and redetermination, preparation and participation in judicial hearings, childcare placements, the recruitment, licensing, and inspection of childcare providers. If we can go to the next slide, please. It also includes training for staff on billing and claims processes associated with a subsidy program, reviews and supervision of childcare placements, activities associated with payment rate setting, resource and referral services, and the training for childcare staff, which is actual providers of services. So I think what's really important about this is that some of these expenditures you might look at and go, well, that certainly does look like an administrative cost. And in most programs we operate, it would be considered one. So it's important to have good communication with your fiscal staff to understand that in coding these type of activities, they can be coded as non-direct services and therefore do not have to be counted against that 15% admin maximum and that limit that you have on those costs. You might also look at that and think, well, some of these could also be considered quality expenditures. So if there's an activity, for example, the reviews and supervision of childcare placements could be considered quality. If that's the case, we would recommend that you count that as a quality activity and report it as such, because as you'll soon learn, we'll discuss that you do have a minimum amount that you must spend on quality. So it's important to remember that there's a number of these non-direct services that could be considered admin, could be considered quality, and it's important to consider the best way to report those because you can only report them in one place. So you want to make sure you report them either as non-direct, if they could be considered admin, or it's to your benefit to consider them as quality and to report them as quality if they could also be considered quality. And I know sometimes there's often questions about that, so I'll just pause for just a minute. Okay. Well, so I also wanted to give a final reminder about non-direct services because we often sometimes will get some questions about non-direct services and how those relate to indirect costs. Non-direct, indirect. Indirect costs are administrative costs under CCDF, and so that's reported on line 5. Any indirect costs would be reported on line 5 under administrative costs. And let's move on to a discussion of quality activities. So line 7.
Excuse me. I do have a quick question about non-direct services. Where would you put building maintenance or repair, for example, for a tribally operated center? Is that non-direct service or is it administrative?
So it depends on the type of activities that would fall under that. There might be some activities that could even be considered as direct childcare, depending on what that is, if the costs associated with operating that center. Does that make sense? So I definitely would recommend in those types of instances that you talk to your regional office and make sure that you understand where that needs to be coded. And
yeah, that makes pretty good sense. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess the potential is it could be reported in a number of different places. Yeah, so it's depending on what the exact expenditure is. Great question. Okay. So quality activities is on line 7. Now this is expenditures for quality activities, but this excludes any specific quality activities that are targeted for infants and toddlers, because those get reported on line 8. Okay, so the quality spending requirement for tribal lead agencies has increased over time. It was 7% for 2019 funds, 8% in 2020 and 21, and 9% in 2022 and beyond. So even though we think, gosh, 2019 was quite a number of years ago, we still know that potentially, especially with fiscal waivers being granted recently, that we have a lot of reports that will date back to 2019 funds. So it's important to keep those different quality requirements in mind. And that quality spending requirement applies to all tribal lead agencies, regardless of allocation size. It's important to remember that at the end of the liquidation period, the sum of the amounts of those columns, similar to administrative costs, when I talked about that for administrative costs, columns A, B, C, D, E, and F on line 7 have to equal at least that minimum threshold of 7, 8, or 9% of those expenditures. Okay, so it's important to look at what line 7 totals across columns needs to equal at least that minimum amount as compared to line 12, which is your total expenditures. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what are some examples of some quality expenditures? Supporting the training, professional development, and post-secondary education of the childcare workforce, developing, implementing, or improving early learning and development guidelines, developing, implementing, or enhancing a tiered QRIS system, a quality rating system, improving the supply and quality of childcare programs and services. And this says for infants and toddlers, but we know we're actually capturing that in line 8. So make a note of that this infant and toddler items are actually captured in line 8. Supporting childcare resource and referral services. And if we go to the next slide, we'll continue. Facilitating compliance with inspection, monitoring, training, and health and safety requirements, evaluating and assessing the quality and effectiveness of childcare programs, supporting childcare providers in the voluntary pursuit of accreditation, supporting development and adoption of high quality program standards, and carrying out other activities to improve the quality of childcare services provided, which I know is a kind of a large category for a lot of programs. So again, 9% minimum for the most recent year's grants, 22 and 23. Prior to that, it's been a varying requirement. And this does apply to tribal lead agencies of all allocation sizes. So important to remember that spending requirement. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So again, this is just a graphic that kind of shows that transition in the requirement, and a reminder that the quality expenditures related to infant and toddler activities are reported in the next line. So let's go ahead and go to the next line.
Patty?
Yes.
Sorry to stop you there. There was a question about line 7 from Erica.
Okay.
Do you want me to read the question or?
Let me look. Oh, so that's great. Let's go back one slide, please, just to remind everyone about the quality expenditures. It's a great slide graphic that shows that. So beginning in grant year 2019, 7% of your total expenditures should reflect quality activities, not including your infant and toddler that you report on separately. In 2020, it would have been 8%. In grant year 2021, it also is 8%. And beginning in year 2022, fiscal year 2022, and moving forward, it's been at that 9%.
And Patty, there was a question about for which tribes this applies to in terms of allocation sizes.
Oh, is there a conflict in the slides? This should apply to all tribal lead agencies of all allocation sizes.
That's right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we will try and correct that if there's a conflict in the slides for sure.
Oh, no, I don't think it was a conflict. I think it was just a clarification.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So if we go to the next slide. Yes.
I have one more question, but you can move to the next slide. It
Okay.
is about infant toddler, actually.
Oh, okay, great.
So my question is this: for a small allocation tribe like mine, I am not required to do infant toddler quality activities, so the 3% doesn't apply to me. So my quality expenditures for infant and toddler, I have been including with line 7 because I want them to account towards my 7, 8, 9% requirement. Should I have been reporting those on line 8 instead?
I think that's a great question. Because I think as a tribe with a small allocation, when the report is being reviewed, you're looking at overall, you want to meet the full quality set aside being the 9% now. And so the concern is in the review of that report, will that be considered if you include items in line 8? Is that what you're asking, if that will be used to meet that? And I'm going to ask our OGM team when they're reviewing a report, if they take that into consideration for a program that's receives a small allocation.
And a follow-up question, should I change that now when I'm doing final reports? Because in the past, I've reported it all on line 7. Should I break it out and put it on 8 if so? Thank you.
No, great question. And so Meryl and Tony, I know you're on the call. Can I put you on the spot to respond to that?
My response is that I have been telling tribes to look at the costs that they are reporting as infant toddler quality activities and see if they meet the criteria on line 7, even though they're for infant toddler.
And so you'd suggest that a program receiving a small allocation should include all of their quality activities in line 7 to ensure they're meeting that quality requirement that's required for all programs.
That's what I would say. Yes.
Okay, great. Does that help, Angie? So I guess the follow-up to that is if you've been doing that, then you wouldn't have to resubmit any revised reports. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's what I've been doing, and I will continue to do it that way. Thanks.
Great question. I'm sure many others have that. Thank you, Meryl, for responding. Okay, so very clear from this discussion, remember that line 8 is expenditures for infant toddler quality activities, and a reminder that tribes receiving medium and large allocations do have a spending requirement to spend at least 3% of their total expenditures on quality activities that are directed towards infant and toddlers. So it's important to remember that applies, as with all these spending requirements, it applies to funds expended, not your total number of funds available. So we're always looking at expenditures that are reported, total expenditures on line 12 when we're looking to meet that spending requirement. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. If you are a grantee receiving a small allocation, you would not need to include this in your report. So what are some examples? Again, establishing, expanding, or promoting a high quality operation of community neighborhood-based family childcare networks and child development centers, childcare providers' ability to provide developmentally appropriate services directed towards infants and toddlers, developing infant and toddler components in the tribal agency's quality rating and improvement system, licensing regulations, or early learning and development guidelines, and providing professional training such as health and safety, safe sleep practices, first aid, CPR for childcare providers and caregivers, again, for those working directly with infants and toddlers. So age appropriate training for infants and toddlers could be considered infant and toddler quality activities. So again, applies to tribal lead agencies with medium and large allocations, and that is a 3% minimum. And of course, you can always expend more, but that's in addition to your currently the 9% minimum quality set aside. Okay. Any other questions about those expenditures? Again, a final reminder that 3% for lead agencies with medium and large allocations has remained stable. That is a 3% minimum that should be spent on quality activities directed to infants and toddlers. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Michael to talk about construction expenditures.
Awesome. Thank you, Patty. So line 9 covers expenditures for construction and major renovation. This line reports the amount of funds expended on construction and major renovation projects, and it only applies to construction accounts. So you can see columns D, E, G, I, K, M, and P would be where this potentially applies to. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so here is where, again, you're going to enter the constructions expenditures. So Rachel mentioned earlier, line 2 covers the amounts that have been transferred into a construction and major renovation grant. And this one is the amount that is expended on funds. A really important note is that in order to expend funds on a construction and major renovation project, there needs to be a separate application that's submitted and approved to the Office of Child Care before funds can be expended on these areas. Can move to the next slide. Okay. So line 10 covers ARP stabilization subgrants to providers. And again, this only covers the ARP stabilization grant, so it only applies to columns N, O, and P. Next slide. So tribal lead agencies must spend the majority of the CCDF funds, so at least 80% of their stabilization grant allocations, not including the base amount, on subgrants to providers. ARP stabilization has a slightly higher administrative cap at 20% than the typical CCDF grant. And so childcare providers may use stabilization grants to cover the following expenses: personnel costs, rent, utilities, facilities maintenance and insurance, personal protective equipment, cleaning and other health and safety practices, equipment and supplies, goods and services, and mental health services. So by the end of the liquidation period, line 10 and column O must be equal to or greater than 80% of line 1, which is the total award amount, in order to maintain that administrative cap requirement. The 80% requirement does not apply to the base amount reported in column N, though base amount funds may be used for the administration and technical assistance expenditures for your stabilization subgrant. Move on to the next slide, please. Line 11 discusses the admin and TA activities for stabilization funds. So again, because this is specific to the ARP stabilization grant, it only applies to columns N, O, and P. Next slide. So tribal lead agencies may spend up to 20% of the Stabilization ARP Act funds, again, not including the base amount, for 5 categories, which are each broken out separately in the 696T. Those 5 categories are in line 11A, subgrant administration. Line 11B is systems. 11C covers technical assistance related to the application process and development. 11D covers technical assistance and implementation. 11E is publicity. 11F is activities to build the supply. And Patty, I see you have your hand up.
I just wanted to raise a question we had in the chat, but it's about construction. So finish the slide. Yeah, definitely
Perfect.
finish the slide.
And so each of these activities need to be included for columns N, O, and P. N again is the stabilization base amount. O is the stabilization funds not including the base amount. And then P is stabilization funds that have been set aside for construction and major renovation. Again, stabilization funds are exempt from CCDF spending requirements related to quality services and direct activities. And so by the end of the liquidation period, line 11, which in column O must be equal to or less than 20% of line 1, which is that total grant amount. This 20% cap does not apply to the base amount. And base amount funds, again, may be used for construction, for administration and technical assistance expenditures. So, Patty, did you want to jump in with that question?
I'd be happy to. So Michael, yeah, we're getting all kinds of questions. It's great. The first is, does construction have the same cost guidelines as well? And I believe that's referring to maybe the spending requirements around admin, et cetera. So does construction have the same cost guidelines? And that's if it's, I'm assuming again, and Ava, please correct me if I'm wrong, that means once funds are transferred into that construction account and they're in that other column, would you have the same cost guidelines?
I don't know, Rachel, I don't know if you want to respond to that one.
Hi, this is Rachel. The construction funds do not need to meet those spending requirements. They have been approved for construction, so they can be used for construction.
And you'll see on our kind of our cheat sheet with our graphic at the top of each page, you'll note, and I know it's hard to tell because it's listed A through P, but the columns that are construction set-asides, because they actually are accounted for differently on the report, those will not be included on those slides where we talk about those different expenditures and those spending requirements. So that's kind of a little helpful sign for you as you go through. And I think there was one more construction question. That they received a notice of award for construction funds with specific conditions, and then they put in a request to repurpose those funds for other allowable CCDF activities, right? So the funds are remaining under that construction notice of award. They're kind of in that same funding stream. So do we just enter the other purpose amount in line 9? So line 9 is your construction expenditure. So they're asking, how do we account for that?
Right. So once the funds have been transferred over to construction, they need to be reported in that construction column. So even if they are repurposed to use for other CCD activities, such as a quality activity, you would still enter it under quality activity in that construction column.
Does that answer the question? I want to make sure because I know that could be very confusing, because we normally say only report construction here. But if you have approval from the Office of Child Care to use those construction funds for other purposes, they can then be included in other line items besides just the construction line item. But that's the only instance once you've been granted that approval.
There are a couple other questions in the chat. And Angie, I see your hand up. So let's get to the questions in the chat and then we'll go over to Angie. So there is a question about to define the base amount. So for the discretionary funds, both the regular annual discretionary funds and the stabilization funds, a base amount of $30,000 was awarded to each tribal lead agency. And then the rest of the funds are awarded on a per child amount. So that's what we talk about with that base amount. It's, you know, a fixed amount for each of the tribal lead agencies that doesn't have to meet those other spending requirements. And then there is a question about the ARPA stabilization grants for the cap, the 20% cap. Included with discretionary expenditures, or is this a separate administration cap? So the stabilization funds have their own separate cap than the regular annual CCDF funds. So that 20% is separate. It includes administrative activities. It includes TA supports that the lead agency is providing to providers to apply for those stabilization grants. So it includes a little bit different activities than what we usually talk about with the administrative cap. And I think there was a slide just before this one or just after that kind of shows that those activities under that cap are just a little bit different than what we consider administrative activities for the other funds.
You might be referring to the supplemental funding administrative resource that's available that shows that.
It was maybe earlier, not exactly sure. But Angie, you had your hand up. It's down now, but I wanted to give you a chance to ask your question.
Thank you. And actually, one of my questions was already answered, and that was about the base amount. I have another question, though, for stabilization funds. So I'm not sure where I report information on lines 10 and 11 when I did not provide subgrants to providers that don't exist. I only operated tribally operated centers. So I'm not exactly sure where I put my expenses in 10 or 11.
So I think, and our OGM colleagues can correct me, but I think sorry, there's also sirens going by, so sorry if I'm loud. The funds that you provide to your tribally operated center through the stabilization grants, I think we would consider as stabilization grants. And so you should include it under that line. Okay, I think we're caught up on the questions, but they're great and awesome. And if we don't have a chance to get to all the questions today, again, we're going to make these slides available and this recording, and our intent is to circle back and provide a frequently asked question document and potentially some office hours for folks to get their questions answered and then to send those questions to everybody. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Thank you, everyone. That was an awesome discussion. And so if we can go on to the next slide. Oh, there was a slide. No, maybe the slide before. I think we might have skipped through one. Yes, okay. So this slide mentions, shows kind of what that breakdown looks like, right? So there are those 6 different areas that we have broken down stabilization administrative costs into. And so this is where you would enter them in each specific category. So now if we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay. So tribal lead agencies may spend up to 20% of ARP stabilization funds. And again, not including that base amount for the 5 categories mentioned previously. And so these are, again, only going to be included for columns M, N, O, and P. And stabilization funds are exempt from the CCDF spending requirements related to quality set aside and the direct services. So by the end of the liquidation period, line 11, column O, again, must be equal to or less than 20% of line 1, which is that total stabilization grant amount. And again, this 20% cap does not apply to the base amount reported in column N, even though base amounts may be used for administration and technical assistance expenditures. So we move on to the next slide. Okay, so line 12 discusses total federal expenditures, and this line applies to all columns in the report. Next slide. Okay, so since OLDC automatically calculates this number based on the earlier entries, you really just need to confirm that the amount is accurate and that these are all liquidated funds. So this is the money that's been drawn down and spent on those accounts. And the next slide. So for line 13, that's where you report the total federal unliquidated obligations. And again, this line applies to all columns. So if we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so in line 13, total federal unliquidated obligations, the tribal lead agency will need to enter in all columns the total amount of obligated federal funds that have not been liquidated from the grant year being reported. So generally speaking, an obligation is an act that commits the funds to a purpose, such as a legally binding agreement, such as a contract, a subgrant, an eligibility determination between 2 parties for the purchase of services, supplies, or equipment. So for each funding stream, there's a different obligation and liquidation requirements, but tribal lead agencies typically have 2 years to obligate mandatory and discretionary funds. So for example, under a typical timeline, GY21 mandatory and discretionary funds must be obligated by September 30th of 2022. Regular mandatory or discretionary funds transferred to construction or renovation do not have an obligation requirement. There's still a liquidation deadline in place, but not an obligation for construction funds. However, in the last 2 years, tribal lead agencies have had the opportunity to apply for temporary fiscal waivers to extend obligation or liquidation deadlines. So you're going to want to refer back to your fiscal waiver approval letter for your specific obligation deadlines on your account. If you don't have or aren't able to locate a copy of your fiscal waiver approval letter, please reach out to your regional office and your program specialist, and we'd be more than happy to provide you a copy of that. And the next slide. So line 14 discusses the total federal unobligated balance. And so this applies to all funding streams. Line 13 and line 14 are especially important in the years that you're running into the obligation deadline on a grant, because that's what lets us know that funds have been obligated timely, and that prevents any potential issues with funds being returned. So you do want to discuss and work closely between your fiscal and program staff to ensure that lines 13 and 14 are correct to account for all of your obligations. And then the next slide. So in line 14, this is again where you're going to report funds that have not been obligated. So after the obligation deadline is passed, this is where we check which funds need to be returned to the federal government for not being obligated timely. So again, super important that you're working together with your program and fiscal staff to ensure that you're reporting your obligations correctly in lines 13 and 14. So in the 696T instruction guide, pages 3 through 7 provide instructions and a description of the obligation and liquidation timeframes. And here in line 14, this should be equal to the line 3 minus any liquidated and obligated funds, so line 12 and 13. So in other words, line 3, which is the total funds available, should be equal to lines 12 plus 13 plus 14, which is the obligation, liquidation, and unobligated funds. I'm going to pause here if there's any questions. I've seen a few things come up in the chat.
Hi, Mike. This is Rachel. There was a question that came up about line 13, unliquidated obligations. So these are obligations that have been made but not yet liquidated. And the question is, do purchase orders not used as of 9/30/2023 need to be entered in this line of unliquidated obligations? So I think there are maybe two answers to this question, not mutually exclusive, but just two different things to consider. One, yes, if you are counting purchase orders as your obligation and they have not yet been used by that date, then they would be considered unliquidated obligations. They're obligations that you've made, but not yet used or liquidated. However, CCDF does not have a specific definition for obligations. So what the law says is that lead agencies need to use their own rules around obligations to define what is a CCDF obligation. So if your tribal lead agency is using your purchase order as an obligation, then yes, that is correct, that this would be entered under line 13, unliquidated obligations. And I think, oh, there was a question about what TA stands for. We throw this term around a lot, and so we always forget to define it, but it's technical assistance. So I think this question came up in the stabilization funds. That's one of the activities that can be included under that 20% maximum. And so the TA stands for technical assistance. This could be support that you're giving to providers and applying for stabilization grants, other kinds of technical assistance that the tribal lead agency is providing. Great, thanks for that, that pause. Oh, there's a question from Erica.
I kind of wanted to piggyback on the question about purchase orders not used as of 9/30. Our tribal organization has the Head Start. We close out all POs at the end of the year, and then they have to reopen new ones regardless of when their fiscal year ends, which is at the end of this month. They still have to enter new POs. Does that go under the same guidelines for the unliquidated obligations?
So it really depends on how your tribal lead agency is defining obligations. It sounds like if those purchase orders are being closed and then a new one is being issued for those funds, that it's that new date of the purchase order that would count towards meeting or not meeting that obligation period. I would recommend reaching for that specific question where it's getting kind of technical and nuanced to reach out to your program specialist and grant specialist to kind of confirm that that's the case.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So if we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so line 14, again, that applied to all columns and all grants within the 696T. Line 14A, the sub-question for this, is specific to columns N and O, which are ARP stabilization. And it's a yes or no question on if the tribal lead agency was unable to obligate at least 50% of your stabilization grants by December 11th, 2021. And so again, that wasn't necessarily a requirement to obligate by that time. So there's no issues there if you do mark no, but it was something that we need to add in for our reporting purposes on if that you were able to accomplish that by December 11th, 2021. We can, okay. And again, this just describes that the ARP Act required tribal lead agencies to report if they were able to obligate at least 50% by December 11th of 2021. And because this is a point in time question, this response should not change from the prior GY 2021 report that the tribal lead agencies submitted. Even if you've obligated all of your funds since then, that status of that question is very much point in time to that date. And so it should not be changing from report to report. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so line 15 discusses reallotted funds. And so here the tribal lead agencies are able to select yes or no, whether your tribal lead agency would like to receive its proportional share of any reallotted discretionary funds that may become available in the second fiscal year of any given grant period. So if tribal lead agencies opt to reallot funds, those funds are distributed amongst other tribal lead agencies. And so here is where you would mark yes or no if you wish to receive your tribe's share of those reallotted funds. And next slide. Okay, so in line 15, this portion of the form is really just a vehicle for you to request funds if they become available. This form is not used to report funds that the tribal lead agency will be unable to obligate. So these amounts must be reported in a letter to OCC through your regional office prior to April 1st, in accordance with unused discretionary funds identified by the April 1st deadline will be reallotted to other tribal lead agencies proportional to their original amounts. So just a note here, if the 696T reports are not received within 90 days of the fiscal year, so that's December 29th of every year, the tribal lead agency will not be eligible for reallotted discretionary funds. So it is really important that your 696Ts be submitted timely and by that December 29th date. Otherwise, your tribe will not be able to receive any reallotted funds. So moving on to the next slide. So one of the final pieces that need to be included with the 696T are narrative reports. So the annual submission of your financial report should include separate narrative reports describing the services and activities funded within each of the following funding streams. So that is going to cover columns F and G, which are the CCDF discretionary disaster relief funds, and that needs to be noted in each annual report. Columns H and I, which are discretionary CARES Act funds. Columns J and K, which are discretionary CURSA funds. And then columns L and M, which are these ARP supplemental discretionary funds. And again, all of these need to be included in each annual report. And so the columns of your report will reflect the spending that has occurred for the activities reported in the narrative. So it's really important that the information that you're writing in the narrative is included in your funding columns here as well. And so these are also going to be entered as an attachment into OLDC. If we can move on to the next slide. So the narrative reports are really a description of what you've spent your funding on. So there's no specified format for the narrative report. They should provide an explanation of the amounts reported in the columns with specific project or activity titles, with a description of deliverables if possible, the name or entities responsible for the project and deliverables, and a description of the outcomes and outputs, such as the number of children or families served, or the products that were produced by the activity. So it's important if you were able to work on activities such as development of standards or serving families, that those are described within your narrative reports. So if activities have not changed since the last ACF-696T, you may use the same wording as the previous report. But again, if there's been any updates or new initiatives or outcomes, you should be reporting that and updating that in your narrative report. These instructions to the narrative reports can be found on page 8 and 9 of the 696T form instructions.
Mike, before we move on, I'm sorry, there's a question in the chat about making corrections to line 15. So line 15 is reallotted funds. And we had said in the presentation that if you don't submit your 696T report, you won't be able to receive those reallotted funds. Really, that's because we try to start that process as soon after we get the 696T reports as possible. So if we don't have your report by the time we start that reallotment process, we can't give you the reallotted funds, right? Like you need to request them to be able to receive them. There's a separate process for reporting if you need to reallot your funds, which is just letting us know by April 1st that you have funds that you're not going to be able to use and you'd like to give that up. And again, the timelines are really set in place so that we can move that process forward instead of continually making adjustments. So I just wanted to get to that question in the chat. Erica, your hand is still up, but I think it's from the last question. And Angie, it looks like you maybe have a question.
Thank you. Yes, I do. Speaking about the narratives on these, so should it be a cumulative narrative for everything that's happened? So things that we've already reported in the previous 696T, or should it be what we've completed during this fiscal year? And I'll give an example. If I spent out all of my CURSA funds, for example, and the previous year, or I don't know, maybe that's not a very good example. I'll go ahead and let you respond. Thank you.
That's a really good question. And we've heard this from other folks. The narrative reports are really a way to understand how these different and unique funding streams were used. And it's not just us who are interested, but other agencies, other level of governments. We are getting a lot of questions about how are these funds used. And so we actually do want, sort of a cumulative report. You want to know all of the things that you've been doing with those funds. And you can just, if you're just doing the same activities that you did last time, you could submit the same report. Or if you're doing a new activity, maybe in that last year, you came up with a new exciting idea of how you're going to use that, you could just add that onto it. And then we have just the one report from these need to be submitted annually because we are continuing to get questions. But in that final report for your very last CURSA funds report, it would be great to have that all in one narrative report so we can just say, okay, these are all the really cool and awesome things that these funds were used for. Thanks for that question. That is a good question.
Great, and I will pass it off to Meryl and Anthony, who will walk us through the final steps in submission of the report.
Okay, first I just want to say on the narratives, that's when you start expending the funds, when you are required to have a narrative. So if you've just obligated the funds, but they're not being expended yet, you don't need to report on the narrative. Okay, so in OLDC, how do we add the narrative? Well, I'm showing you an example of an edit revision, just because this will be similar to what you do if you were first putting your report in the system. You will have the ability to add the attachment. Now you'll notice submission accepted by central central office. That is for anytime you're going to revise your report, you need to have it CO accepted first in order to be able to do that. So I wanted to bring that up. Your report status is informing you of where we're at. If it says submitted, but you haven't had I haven't had a chance to put it under review, you'll just see that it's been submitted. But then this will change to in RO review, and then it will change to RO accepted. And then from there, we move on to the central office accepted for CO. Okay, so you're going to initialize the report. And your file attachments are going to be attached. You'll see where it says form attachment. I uploaded that information from a tribe who had reported it, but not on that quarter's report. So I added it to it just to keep it consistent. Like I said, or I should say, like Michael said, that you do want to make sure you put a narrative on every quarter's report if you've expended funds for it. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So after you've initialized the report, you will see this screen that's going to tell you save, view, or add attachments, validate, and print. So you want to click on the view, add attachments. Okay. Now, yes, reports come in through OLDC. First thing you need to do, though, is have access to Grant Solutions. And Grant Solutions has a different form that they have you complete for that process. But once you are in Grant Solutions and you get a user profile set up for you in Grant Solutions, that piece will allow you to get a copy of your grant award documents. OLDC is strictly for submitting the ACF-696T reports. So you will be going to the login button and hitting that. If you do not have an account in Grant Solutions, it will give you a screen which allows you to say, oh, I don't have access, but I'd like it. And you click on it, and that will give you the information that you need to provide to them, and you send it to them directly. Once again, you always save every response you get back from Grant Solutions because it will have significant information for you, such as your user ID, your password, things like that. So you want to make sure you hold on to them and don't lose them. Okay, once you've gone in, you need to determine what your roles are going to be. And any of the people in your tribal agency that need to be part of the process. So there's a grant administrator, which is all roles. Data entry, which allows you certain functions, and then the authorized official and grant director for certifying with signature authority. Now, so you are aware, we can grant other roles to you if the agency would like that. For example, the data entry person can be allowed to certify if, for example, something happens and you don't have a grant director anymore, or an authorized official. That's when you want the capability to be able to certify and submit the report on time. So just let your grants management specialists know, or your program specialists in the region, and they will let us know what needs to be done, and we will let you know then what needs to be done. Next screen, please. Okay, so once you get into OLDC, this is the screen you're going to find. Each of these are drop-down menus. So if you type in CH for the program name, it will automatically come up to Child Care and Developmental Fund, Mandatory and Matching. You'll see it much easier, quicker than if you try scrolling down. The next is the grantee name. So they're set up by state. And sometimes you can click on them and it'll give you maybe only 3 choices. Other times it doesn't do that, and you have to scroll all the way through to find your tribe. Then you go to the report name. You have expenditure tribes only ACF-696T, but that's not quite correct, because you actually are asked if it's for grant year 2020 and prior, or grant year 2021 and subsequent years. So make sure if you're going in for a grant year 2020, you do select the right option. It will give you a listing below then of your grant number and year. The year is the first part of the identification of your grant number. Next screen, please. So that was just giving you the steps. Okay, in this one, this is just giving you information on the reporting periods. So when you see these reporting periods, you are required to report at least in the first and second year and the third year if necessary. And I say that because some tribes close their books by the end of the first year. Some tribes close their books by the end of the second year. And some take full advantage and go for the third year. The first 2 years are your obligation periods. That's when all funds that you're going to expend need to be obligated by the second year of the grant's life. The third year that's been added is strictly for liquidating any of the unliquidated obligations that still remain. But everything must be liquidated if you plan on using it by that date. Otherwise, it'll be de-obligated from your grant. Okay, next slide, please. So the progress bar after you get started with inputting your information is going to tell you the status of where you're at. You'll see it will gray out the area saying, okay, you've initialized the report. Once you've saved and edit, that little area will darken as well. And it goes right down the line. Okay, next screen. Okay, so certification of the report. this is where you find the information. It should be at the top of your report. You'll see save, view, add attachments, validate, certify, or print. So once you've done, and you have to do them in order, save, then view, then validate. If you make a change, you have to go back to the beginning to save, resave it, add your attachments if necessary, and then validate it again before you are able to certify it. Once you certify, it should drop down to the signature of authorized certifying official on line 18B, and you just click that to sign. Once you've certified, then you submit. Now, if you are unable to submit the report, please let your financial management specialist know that you have an issue, you're not able to submit, and that person can do it for you. But we cannot certify your report. That is totally an agency responsibility, a tribal agency responsibility. Okay, and then after you submit, you can print your report. Okay, next slide, please. So once you've e-signed the report, this is where it shows that you've e-signed it. Okay, next slide. And I think that might be the end. Yes. Are there
Thank
any
you, Meryl.
questions before I leave? Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Meryl. Thank you, OGM. Thank you, OCC. That does wrap up our presentation here on the 696T high-level overview of our presentation. Where do we get information? Here, we just want to bring this back around to be sure that you all know how you can get help through these areas of resources here listed on the screen. That is where you'll begin by making sure you do get a copy of the instructions, as well as looking at the form, printing it, and being kind of just outlining that as well. And then again, we'll go ahead and drop this information into the chat box for you all to be able to grab that, as well as we would also like to mention to look forward to information around an office hour that we do plan to have available for additional questions around the 696T. So again, just look out for that information through email. Again, we'll go ahead and drop this information of resources in the chat box. And we also want to be sure to say that we are so grateful that you all were able to join us today. Appreciate all the time, especially the interaction of questions and those questions that you brought to the table here. We also want to see if you guys could provide us some feedback on where we could improve and what we could improve. We'll go ahead and drop that feedback survey link in the chat box as well on what we can do to see what we can do to improve and better serve you around this topic or any other areas within our presentation. That does wrap up again our presentation. Do we have any other last minute thoughts that maybe OCC would like to add to our ending of presentation?
I did want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I know this was a ton of information. I really love the questions coming in. We will said this in a couple of times in the chat, that we will distribute these slides and the recording to attendees. And also it's going to be posted on the TCBC website. We have to send it through some like processing so that we can post it to the website. So it usually takes about a week to get this stuff online. But we're hoping that this can also be used as a resource if you forgot something or you want to share it with your colleague who wasn't able to make it to the presentation. This way they'll be able to join the presentation. And like Dee said, we have some opportunities coming up that if you have additional questions, or once you think about it, or once you get started on your report, questions that come up, we want to make sure that you have a chance to answer those. So thank you so much, our colleagues in TCBC, for supporting us and putting this together. Thank you to my colleagues in the Office of Childcare and the Office of Grants Management. This was a nice partnership for us all to come together to really, at the federal level, to bring together the program and the fiscal folks to be able to get this information out. So thank you all so much for joining us today.